How would you figure out what something is made of? Would you try to take it apart or use a tool to look at it more closely? Scientists in the 1600s were very interested in what had made up living organisms. Their observations and conclusions are still relevant today. The discovery of cells depended on advances in technology, in particular microscopes. In the 1590s, Zacharias Janssen worked on both telescopes and microscopes. Janssen, with his father, discovered that looking at an object with more than one lens made its image even larger. They invented the first simple compound microscope using two lenses and a tube. The next major advance was made by Antony van Leeuwenhoek around 1668, who built microscopes and used them to study cells, like bacteria and algae. Technology remained static until 1850s. During this era is when German microscope manufacturer Carl Zeiss hired glass chemist Otto Scott and physicist Ernest Abbe, and they started to make many improvements on the microscopes they produced. All of these microscopes relied on light. Modern light microscopes can be used to see objects larger than 200 nanometers. Electron microscopes were developed in the 20th century. They can be used to see objects as small as 5/100ths of a nanometer, or 4,000 times smaller. Before the 1600s, people did not know that cells existed at all. This may be hard to believe considering how much we know about cells now. Scientists did believe that living things were composed of one or more basic building blocks, but they did not know what those building blocks looked like. Thanks to the work of Robert Hooke, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, Matthias Jacob Schleiden, Theodore Swan, Rudolf Virchow, and other scientists, the cell theory was developed. The British scientist Robert Hooke was the first person to observe matter made up of what he called cells. In the 1660s, Hooke used a microscope to look at cork from the bark of a cork oak tree. He noted the cork looked like it was made of small compartments that reminded him of the rooms or cells in which monks lived. For this reason, Hooke named the structures he observed cells. Hooke was unknowingly observing non-living cell walls. Antony van Leeuwenhoek was observing living cells under a microscope around this time. He examined what he called animalcules, what we now call microorganisms. Based on his notes, scientists today think that van Leeuwenhoek was observing algae and bacteria. Matthias Jacob Schleiden, Theodore Swan, and Rudolf Virchow were the three scientists who typically are given the credit for developing the cell theory. Schleiden studied plants and discovered they were made of cells. Around the same time, Swan discovered animals were made of cells. In 1838, Schleiden and Swan proposed the first two parts of the current cell theory. The theory states that all living things are made of cells and that cells are the basic units of structure and function of living things. Virchow developed the third part of the cell theory, which states that cells arise from pre-existing cells. The term theory is used in a variety of ways in everyday speech. In science, a theory is defined as an explanation of some part of the natural world that came about through the scientific method, is supported by many different types of evidence, and has been repeatedly tested and confirmed through observation and experimentation. Another example of a theory in biology is the germ theory of disease. It states that microorganisms, too small to see, using just the human eye, invade another organism and cause disease. The cell theory is one of the fundamental theories of biology. In its modern form, cell theory has the following parts. All living things we know of are composed of cells. Every living cell comes from another living cell through the process of cell division. Cells are the basic unit of life. An organism's function depends on the functions of its cells. Chemical reactions happen in cells. Cells contain inherited information in DNA and pass this DNA from cell to cell, and cells are composed of the same biological building blocks. That is the cell theory and its history. Thank you for watching.